Imagine taking your generosity to the next level, impacting more lives and leaving a godly legacy for generations to come. Get ideas and strategies to do just that when you listen to these personal stories from high-level kingdom champions. The Kingdom Investor Podcast showcases business leaders who have moved from success to significance, sharing how they use worldly wealth for kingdom impact. Discover how they grew in generosity, impacted more lives, and built godly legacies. You'll find motivation, inspiration, and practical steps to grow as a kingdom investor.
Good morning and welcome to the Kingdom Investor Podcast. Today I have my friend Dave Burton with us in the studio. So Dave, would you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, where you're located, and just kind of give an intro?
Yeah, we live here in Lexington. My wife, Mary Beth, and I have been married 38 years. We have 3 grown children, 2 boys and a girl. We have been here in Lexington for the last 35 years. So this has really become home, definitely home for our children. I'm originally from Virginia. Do you like a little background on that? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll go back a little bit further. I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, in the southwest part of the state. Went to school at Virginia Tech, became a Christian really in high school through our church ministry. But when I was at Virginia Tech, I was very involved in the ministry of Campus Crusade for Christ, known as CRU today. And it had a very foundational impact on me, a lot of practical hands-on ministry in a secular university, and had a big impact. And when I graduated, I came on staff with them full time many years ago. So I spent most of the early years in the Midwest, and then in the late 80s was asked to come down director of ministry at the University of Kentucky. So that's what brought us to this area.
Gotcha. That's good. Do you mind praying for our listeners as we get started here, and just God would use this show to inspire and motivate people to invest in his kingdom?
Sure. Thank you for this beautiful morning that we enjoy. Thank you for your heart for the things we talk about. Pray that we'd represent them well, that you'd be pleased, and that we would encourage each other to love and good deeds. Show us how to do that. Lord, we are so grateful for what this podcast is about. Pray for its success and for its expansion throughout the nation. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, David. So can you tell us a little bit about your career and how that started, and ministry, and how that led into your career and what you're doing now?
Right. Going back a ways, in college, I was a marketing major and enjoyed business. My dad was a businessman, had his own company, and considered going into that. But the Lord kind of got a hold of my heart through college. And I was like, just rather, at least for a while, absorb myself in working with people. So that was part of my decision. I really thought I'd probably be in a church-based ministry, but then with college students, I realized what a strategic area and how much I enjoyed it. And so we kind of moved into that. And so my wife and I both, from a kingdom perspective, just thought that's the best use of what God has given us, is to reinvest in college students. So we did that for many years, really nearly 20 years. To some degree, though about 15 of that was really full time. After that, my professional career sort of split to some degree, because in the early 90s, I began investing in real estate. I had at earlier times, but had put it to the side because of how busy raising 3 kids, running a ministry was. I put that to the side, but things changed. I was no longer director. I was actually taking a year off to go to seminary. At that same time, a property that I had held for a while sold, and I had to reinvest it. And that ended up being reinvested on campus, at a campus property. Well, that went well, and I decided, let's do that again. So very quickly, I had a few properties. And then with that, probably inadvertently made a decision, or maybe directly, but it was kind of like, well, if 3 of these works this well, let's just go ahead and do some more. So I began replicating a little pattern I'd come up with. And most investors are like that. They find something that works, and then they replicate it. And that's what I did very quickly for about a 7-8 year period, and expanded very quickly, and then had the funding to live off if I so chose. But we decided to stay on staff. We enjoyed what we were doing, and were able to lessen the needs of our support raising. But then eventually it became obvious that it's probably better for us to just go to a full-time volunteer situation.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
So since then, that was in the early 2000s where we kind of made that split. And we've continued to volunteer quite a bit. My wife and I kind of laugh that we're professional volunteers. And if you looked at our schedule through those years, you would say, yeah, you put a lot of time into places, and particularly even some more so than my wife, almost 40 hours a week. And I do a lot of things. But on the real estate side, we began, as often happens. So I don't know if I was bored or was interested in other areas, but I had a good basis of real estate to work off of. So we began moving towards commercial things, which I did to some success, sometimes failures in that area. But we began developing more multifamily and the commercial properties around Lexington, built quite a few places, got involved in some different businesses, have partners in a couple of restaurants, some coffee shops, metal fabrication and finishing. So we got a variety of things that we're involved in these days that I enjoy. Honestly, looking back, I was probably entrepreneurial from early on. I was buying bicycles when I was a kid and fixing them up and selling them to other kids. Did the same thing with cars. And it's a pattern through my life that when you're older and you look back, you realize I've been doing this my whole life.
Yeah. So it sounds like, at least in the beginning, the primary way that you invested in God's kingdom was really your time.
Mm-hmm.
So what did that look like as a professional volunteer, as you said? What did like your week look like? Was that?
Well, it varied. We were still continuing to go to campus. And so I would swing by some of the schools here locally and counsel with other staff and help them. But my flexibility, maybe sometimes on the way home, I would stop and take care of an issue, meet with a manager, things like that. My wife was involved in Bible study fellowship, but as a teaching leader, it took 30, 40 hours a week. So she was doing that. She's never really been that involved in the real estate side. And that's fine. We just had different interests and that worked out well. But it gave me flexibility. At times I wonder if I'm always efficient with my time. Unfortunately, when you have a little more time than you need, some days you stretch out your work in ways that aren't as efficient. You know
Right.
how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the reason that I was asking that is because a lot of times when you get into business and investing, it's just really all consuming. And it's like, get to the next deal as fast as you can and run. And so how did you kind of balance investing a lot of your time early on in ministry and still doing business on the side or building up this portfolio of rental property and different investment opportunities? What did that look like?
Well, I will say intentionally, I took my foot off the pedal a few times, knowing that why do I need any more?
Mm-hmm.
There's always opportunities out there. It's a little slimmer these days, it seems like, naturally. But with the economy, anytime it changes, good or bad, there's going to be new opportunities. And it's kind of hard to say no.
Yeah.
And there's some times I should have said no, really. I've got involved in things that taken a lot more of my time and ate my time, didn't make much money. But it's always either make money or get an education. I've got an education a few times.
Yeah.
But the wins have been much more than the losses, so that works out okay. So it's a tricky balance there. I think it requires actually more discipline. When I was on staff, you knew that was your job and you needed to show up and you had people responsible to you. When you don't have that as much, it takes more initiative to stay on task. Actually, I've struggled with that at times where I feel like I'm really using myself well. Or I probably can be doing more. My natural bent is I enjoy using my hands. I enjoy projects that I can see the immediate progress in. As a real estate investor, especially early on, we had no money, but we had some time, scratch some time together. So I did a lot of things myself. But I enjoy that. I still do a lot of things myself just to kind of stay in the mix, so to speak. And I enjoy seeing the progress. So often in any kind of ministry setting, you don't see the results right away. You have to wait a long time and look back on your life and say, oh, that was significant investment I made. So anyway.
I can really relate to that a lot because I have a background in construction. And so I loved at the end of the day, just seeing, hey, I built that. I created that out of nothing or material. And it was really it's so satisfying. And then you do ministry and you're investing for really a long term investing and you don't get to see the results for a long time. And sometimes there aren't any results in some instances. And
absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the things that we've started doing in our small group is really trying to highlight the things that God is doing in the last couple of weeks or last couple of months and everything. And remember to worship him for how he has been faithful in our lives and how he's continuing to be faithful, because it's just, you need that encouragement to see and look back on lives changed and relationships built and people taking, one step closer to being a true disciple of Jesus Christ, just so you can continue on in investing.
Right. To me, that's remembering the whys of what we're doing. And if you don't revisit that often, you will grow very weary. And sometimes, you have times where you don't have a lot to show. and you have to look and find what you can. And let's emphasize that for today.
Yeah.
Investing, I tell my sons, I say, there's some days you just have to focus on what you have and not what you don't have.
Right.
That usually comes after you've missed a big deal or something's gone horribly sideways. And you just kind of put that aside and say, what do I have today?
Yeah.
And you do the same thing in ministry at times.
Mm-hmm.
There's conflict, there's issues, there's things that you don't put in the newsletter, but there's stuff that happens. And you got to really look at what God is doing and how he's working in your life, not necessarily always in someone else's life.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more and drill down on the business and how you got into different real estate opportunities and different business ventures and everything.
Yeah, we started with a duplex on campus, though we're in Chicago at Northwestern University. I had a duplex there. We lived downstairs, rented out the upstairs, and it worked well. And when I sold it, we did well on it. And that gave us a little bit of seed money. So that was my first taste of real estate. And it was a good taste. It went for me. Fortunately, the first one went well. It didn't always happen that way, but for me, it did. And though I set that on the back burner for a number of years because the work we were doing, the age of my kids, I needed to give that my full attention. Mm-hmm. But when I did kind of come back to that in the early 90s, like I said, it went well. I'd owned a single family house that just kind of languished. I had bought it early on and sat on it for about 5 years. When that sold, hopefully there's something better. And I did find that what better. And then fairly quickly figured out a pattern of buying things within walking distance to the campus, something that was old that could be renovated, something that we could put money into, push the value, pull the money back out, move on to the next one. Because we didn't have very much income. It was important for us to keep some seed money fresh that we could.
So how did you get into your first deal coming out of ministry or being in ministry and not really having a large income?
Yeah, we, at least on one of those properties, we had a co-signer. We did find a bank that was a small local bank that would work with us, could see our track record. I did not have a lot of history. They took a risk on me. Yeah. But once I got established and going, and in some ways it got easier, some ways it got harder. But those first few, I guess I'd already had a taste of it earlier on. So I kind of knew it could work. Yeah. It was just a matter of could. And really, when I found something that worked well, that's when I would suggest, and this is why I counsel others today, when you find something you like and it works well, okay, it's time to dig in and repeat that if it's possible. And it usually is. And that's what I did.
So you were talking about getting into more commercial space, and what kind of properties were you acquiring in that space?
About 10 years in, I got involved in some development of some townhomes, 66 townhomes that we developed out on the edge of town, another city close by with a friend. I did another 20 or so. Those were kind of larger developments that was definitely away from the onesie twosie that I had done. Though we found some land and developed some properties that we could built about 13 properties there within a few years stretch, kind of went on a tear. In some ways, look back, think I should have stuck with that. Our larger projects went fine, but we had to wait for a long time for them to really come to fruition. Yeah. And they were good long-term holds, but they did not produce a lot of cash early on. Yeah. And I should have just stayed where I was. So that was one chapter. Later on, when my oldest son was out of college and he began developing, he worked for a commercial broker for a little while. He set his sights more on commercial property. So really for the last several years, I've been following him around as he's bird dogged and found places that are good opportunities that he has kind of led the way on that. And so we've had a good partnership where I've had the financial stability, lending ability, and so on. And he's good on his feet and goes out and finds places. So it's made a good partnership for me and for him. And I would suggest that for anybody. If you need different aspects to be an investor, you need the ability to find properties and develop, but you also need financial backing. And if you don't have either of it, you find someone who does, and that would probably be a good partnership for you. Right. Doing something either you can't do or you don't want to do. Yeah. But you do have some financial footing that you can actually help make it happen. Yep. That's a good example. The restaurants were through him as well. That's where that got started. That kind of a different chapter that I've enjoyed. It's been good.
Gotcha. When did the restaurants start?
2011, local taco here in Lexington. And then coffee shops here in the last few years through a building at Dudley Square that we acquired. Yeah. And so that's been successful.
Good. So tell us more about what you're doing now with ministry, and you mentor a lot of people and disciple different people, and tell us a little bit more about what you're doing as far as that goes.
Well, some of that is just as it happens. I get calls pretty regularly from particularly young men who just want to talk, and which I'm glad to talk about and tell them my story and coach them a little bit on what maybe they could invest in, what would fit them well. So that happens part of a small group that meets weekly. I lend my time to particularly Young Life, been on their committee, been committee chair for a number of years, and counsel their staff and also help guide a few things there as well. That's one of the bigger things. Our church I'm involved with pretty heavily there, young couples class, my wife and help coach and teach. Those are some of the areas that they're involved in.
So would you mind sharing one of the failures that you've maybe learned the most in the investing and business world?
Probably, yeah. Just more recently in the last few years, I got involved in a project that did not have the supervision that it really needed. I went in as a passive investor, throwing some money into it, like a good project, be interesting to be involved in. It nearly collapsed. I and one of the other investors jumped in the middle of it, and it sucked a couple of years of my time that I would like to have had back, as well as more money. But so I would call it a successful failure like Apollo 13, and that it did not suck us under, but it could have hurt a lot more than it did. In hindsight, I have promised all those close to me that I'll not ever get involved in a project like that again. I may be divorced or fatherless if I do, because I would come home and complain about my day of what I'm doing to salvage something that wasn't my mess. But I mean, to some degree, no one put a gun to my head to invest. And I did, but I had to dig our way out, and we are out now. So it can happen. And that didn't happen 20 years ago. That happened like 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah. So anybody can make a mistake. Yeah. The only thing I can say is I guarded my downside. I signed up on some loans with that, but only to a limited degree, knowing that the downside is only going to be so far down. Yeah. That being said, I didn't really, when it came down to it, I didn't want to lose that money too. So it was like, well, I can either grab a shovel and start digging and get us out of here, or I can let it collapse and take a much bigger hit. So it was a definite failure. And it's probably a lesson that most of us are more prone to failure than we realize. Yeah. And it could have been pride that I would not make a mistake. And I did.
Right. So shifting gears here a little bit, let's talk about what you see looking back as some of the key things that really changed the trajectory of your faith walk and really helped you to see, okay, how do I invest in God's kingdom? How do I invest in things that matter? And maybe even, some of the barriers to growing in being more generous and being a kingdom investor.
All right. Well, ministry that you've highlighted here is journey of generosity. And when that word journey is a very appropriate word, particularly for me, that it has been that, and we're still on it. Yeah. I've listened to your podcast and been pleased by the people I've heard and realized not sure if I'm as far in this journey as I need to be. I need to pick up the pace. So that's been something for me to consider. But our journey is interesting in that we both had opportunities coming out of college to have lucrative careers. My father's business would have been a natural. My wife's an occupational therapist by trade. We could have done very well financially right off the bat. And yet we chose to go out and work for a campus ministry. No complaints. But it was definite choice that we are not going to keep up with the Joneses or any of our other friends making the kind of money we are going to make. And we knew that, and we were fine with that. We decided that's the Lord's call in our lives, and we're not making a sacrifice for this. This is our pleasure to do this for the Lord. So that's a part of our journey. So some things were sacrificed early on. As far as open-handedness, you almost put yourself in that situation, just like someone going into maybe education or something else. You're just not going to make a lot there, and you're making that choice and do it with your eyes wide open. So we had other options. We chose not to go that way, and we worked with people in the campus ministry who were very talented and had skills that they in the marketplace could have made a lot of money. And so I loved the staff that we worked with, and I was very proud of them. And we were all making sacrifices to be there and do what we did. So that kind of was formative for us.
So you were pretty young at that time, is that?
Yeah, 22. Yeah.
Yeah. So what led up to that in making some of those big decisions and sacrifices early on and really setting the trajectory of where you were going?
Well, I don't know. There's a variety of things. I think for me, especially with some entrepreneurial bones and genes in my background, I was fortunate to see my dad was a neat and a great man. I learned a lot from him, but I also learned from him watching him spend money on things and seeing how temporal they were and realizing those aren't going to last. And frankly, even in my own testimony, I was pretty materialistic early on and had a car when I was 16 and spent a lot of money fixing it up. Back in those days, it was mag wheels and triaxial speakers and things like that. And I spent a ton of time keeping that thing clean. If a speck of dust got on it, then it was time to wash it. So I was pretty materialistic in those days. And yet, even in my journey to coming to faith, realized this ain't it. I can look ahead and see what's coming. If I just keep doing this, I'm going to end up like this. And that's not a life worth living. And at the same time, I watched some other fellows. This was in high school. I watched some other fellows who seemed they had joy that I did not have. They had hope and confidence I didn't have. And I was like, I'm on the wrong track here. And that led me to becoming a Christian. That's kind of how it happened. And then I was tutored, I guess, in giving your life away through college. So you wouldn't think that going to a secular university would do that, but it was a great greenhouse of speaking in different places, leading Bible studies in the dorms, outreaches we did. I mean, we were just involved in a lot of people's lives and got to see changed lives. I got to see a lot of cool things. And frankly, these days, I even hear back from people now from those years who are having tremendous impact in the world, the Christian world, who I had a chance to influence when they're pastors, missionaries, they're leaders of ministries that started 30, 40 years ago. It's kind of like real estate in the sense, if you just buy early and you hold for a long time, good things will typically happen. And the same thing that I was able to plant some seeds early in my life that have grown and they're fun to hear about.
It's like compound interest.
It's compound interest, exactly. And so fortunately, I sowed some good seeds in other people's lives that have been fruitful, and they've gone way, way beyond where I'm at as far as visibly with their impact on the world. So anyway, I got to see some of that. So that it made the decision to join a staff of ministry pretty easy. It surely did.
Yeah, that's good.
You mentioned barriers. Let me just kind of mention, and you mentioned journey. Maybe this would be a good time to go ahead and share some things, because it's not like when I was 22, I arrived at this and it's all been downhill from there. It's all been pretty easy stuff. No, it's not at all. There's plenty of barriers. My heart at times feels like it's a puppy dog that just kind of runs off and it gets its nose into stuff. And I just go, well, where's your heart going? And that's Psalm 23 or 123. Let's see. Proverbs 23:4 says, guard your heart. And that's a great verse. I have to intentionally guard my heart because I find it wandering off into other things and distracted. I think one of the things a barrier that most of us face is the society we live, that we are basically in a swamp of materialism and we're waist deep. And if we don't recognize that and look for higher ground, we won't even realize what's happening around us. We need to recognize where that's at and seek out higher ground. I remember back in college when I was in a marketing class one day, and we were talking about the Clio Awards, which are the international awards for marketing and media primarily. So we sat in the class and watched commercials the whole time. And I remember coming out of that class feeling so discontent. Didn't know why, just walking along back to the dorm. Boy, I felt so discontent about I'm missing out on everything in life. And it dawned on me that it's because I've been watching for the last 30 minutes or last hour, everything I don't have, and couldn't put my finger on it. But I think we live in that society and we live in it that gears us toward discontentment of what we have.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was reading a statistic recently that Americans during the holidays, because we're coming up on Christmas and everything, and during the Christmas season, we Americans spend, I think it's 600 billion just on gifts and holiday things. And it's like, could that be put to better use?
Yeah, absolutely. That's funny you had mentioned Christmas, because another scene from my background of discontentment was our church, which is located nearly near where we're at. For years, we would go to the Christmas Eve service, and then on the way home, we would stop by a fairly nice, or actually a very nice neighborhood on the south end of town. And we would drive around. We would go there because the lights were so good. Yeah. I mean, these were a lot of young, affluent people, and the lights were so good. And we would go there and drive around for a while and enjoy the lights and stuff and go home. Well, the funny thing is I'd get to my house and feel like I live in a dump. Look at the light. The lights are bad. It's not very big. It's not very attractive. I was very discontent time I got to my house, and I realized it was simply what we had been looking at for a while. The funny thing in this particular neighborhood, they've since taken this, there were some bywords underneath the name of the neighborhood, which will remain nameless, but underneath the sign going back in the 80s and the 90s was the words, the enviable address. And doggone it, it was for me. Because when I left there and went home, I was envious of what they had. They did a great job. The funny thing is, we never did this, I don't think. We stopped doing that, by the way. That's just not working. It's not good for our kids, for that matter, either. I think they probably were like, gee, Dad, we should be living there.
Right.
The thing we should have done, realistically, and I don't think we ever did, was we should have left our church and gone to a neighborhood that was underserved or poor, or whatever terminology you want to use. But anyway, small homes, maybe needing repair, blah, blah, blah. And then go and drove around for 20 minutes there is what we should do. And by the time we got home, we'd be thinking, wow, I live in a castle. I got 1,600 square feet in a garage. Man, I'm doing well. So it's kind of what you expose yourself to there. That might be a word I would say is exposure is the key to commitment. I'm not sure if I came up with that or someone else, but I've shared that with people along the way, that whatever you regularly expose yourself to is going to be what you find yourself committed to. And if you don't find a way of breaking out of materialistic society and expose yourself to something else, you're just going to be sucked in. You're going to stay in the swamp and not realize your feet are getting rippled and curled from the water. It's just going to happen.